couple of high-tech false starts here this morning. The program is Viewpoint. Mr. Nat King Cole's Unforgettable, introducing us with his theme song. Very appropriate, Mrs. Busby, to have Unforgettable as our theme song this morning. We have a guest this morning that has some unforgettable memories and has written so lucidly about it. Each and every war had its kind of watershed battles. World War II and perhaps Battle of Chateau Thierry de Marne or whatever, and of course World War II, the Battle of the Bulge comes to mind as one of the biggies, and then we go to Korea, and then finally we get to Vietnam, where we go to a place called the Ia Drang Valley. And I would submit that every GI in every battle thinks that that particular day is a watershed moment for him. Certainly, the Ia Drang Valley battle has been written about by our guest in a very, very lucid way. He was with Lieutenant Colonel at the time, Hal Moore, and now he's Lieutenant General. And he has written one of the most compelling and gripping books about any event in any war. As you know, I'm kind of a history buff and an avaricious reader. I couldn't put this book down. I would think that, every war correspondent, every war had a correspondent that was outstanding. We had Ernie Pyle, who was the GI's writer, and every mother in the country read every morning Ernie Pyle's reports from what was known as the front. His book was called Here's Your War. I would submit to you that our guest has written a book that made him the Vietnam's Ernie Pyle, and I can't think of a higher approbation. Would you go ahead, please, and introduce our guest, Mrs. Busby? Isn't that a formal thing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd be very honored to introduce Mr. Joseph L. Galloway, military correspondent, and Mr. Galloway was a citizen soldier as well. In a book review, the Wall Street Journal said, between experiencing combat and reading it lies a vast chasm, but this book almost makes you smell it. And you have certainly served with some very honorable people. Your book, of course, is called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. That's the sad part of war. All the soldiers are so young.
And think how old that is now. The book was published in 1992, written about a November 1965 episode.
Yes, 3 of my relatives were over there, and they probably experienced some of the same sorts of things you did. We here at home, we're getting awfully mixed messages. So, Mr. Joseph L. Galloway, tell us how you felt about that time in our history.
Oh, it was so long ago, and yet it seems like only last night.
Yeah.
I went to Vietnam. I was 23 years old. I had been trying to get there for 2 years, since 1963.
Think of that.
I knew that there was a war coming, that it was going to become an American war and my generation's war, and I thought as a journalist, it would be a lot easier to explain why I went 50 years later than it would be to explain why I didn't go.
Yeah.
And so I was hot to get there, and, it was early innings. I arrived in Vietnam in April of 1965, right after the 1st Battalion of U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang, and spent my first 7 months covering the Marines. And then, the Marines walked to work everywhere they went, and I wore out a couple of pair of combat boots, trailing along after them. And I heard about this newly arriving experimental division that had 435 helicopters in its inventory, And I thought, I'll go cover those guys, and I get to ride to war. And so I did.
How'd that work out? Not so well.
Not necessarily very good, because eventually you have to get off that helicopter and walk through the jungle and chase after people who are chasing after you, and so we come to the Iodine Valley, which was 20 miles from the nearest road, and really the enemy's sanctuary. Had never been penetrated by the French or the South Vietnamese army. It was their territory, very wild and unpopulated, except for a scattering of Montagnard tribesmen who were, kind of moved around and did a little farming for a couple of years and then moved off. And we were only able to get there because of the helicopters. And Colonel Moore had orders to go in and see what he could find, and he just happened to land his battalion of 450 men right smack in the middle of almost a division of very good North Vietnamese regular army soldiers who had fairly recently come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and decided to get involved in this war in the South against the Americans. And very quickly we were surrounded, and this was the 7th Cavalry I'm talking about, and Custer's old outfit, and here we were in another river valley 100-odd years later, surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting for our lives.
Yeah, it reminds me of the famous old set that was attributed to George Custer, never saw so damn many Indians in his life.
Exactly. Well, it was pretty much that way for us. There were a lot of bad guys out there, and they wanted very much to kill us all, and they set about that with great courage. We fortunately had, because of those helicopters, we had an artillery fire base set up less than 5 miles away, and they were firing constantly in support of us. And as the battle wore on, Colonel Moore broadcast the code Broken Arrow, which at that time meant an American unit in dire danger of being overrun by the enemy. And what that meant was that every American warplane in South Vietnam was diverted to our support. And so we were surrounded by the enemy, but we were also surrounded by an absolute wall of steel from the bombs and the napalm and the artillery rounds. The 2 batteries of artillery 5 miles away fired 21,000 rounds of 105 millimeter artillery in a circle around us. They built a wall of steel. And thus we were able to hang on.
Barely.
And, ultimately, by the end of the 3rd day, the enemy had begun withdrawing toward the border with Cambodia.
Mr. Galloway, you were 23 years young at that time, and as we used to say when I was in the military, sometimes you're young and dumb. Never volunteer for things. I had that experience a couple of times and wondered why I volunteered. Let me ask you, sir, how did you hit upon the career of journalism? Which is certainly the right career for Joe Galloway.
I almost think I was born to it. I started my first newspaper when I was about 10 years old. I traded a bicycle to my uncle for a 1916 typewriter and started a neighborhood newspaper in this oil camp where my family and I lived with about 40 other families out on the Texas prairie near Corpus Christi. And I worked for the school newspaper in high school, and when I graduated, I helped start a competition weekly newspaper in my little hometown of Refugio, a population about 4,000 then. And that newspaper's still publishing today. In fact, it's the only newspaper in that little town.
What a remarkable.
And I set off to college and lasted 6 weeks.
Oh, dear.
And I was on my way to the Army recruiter to sign up and get the hell out of there. And I had to take my mother because I was only just turned 17.
Yes.
And I had to have a parent's signature to join. And I had browbeaten her into finally agreeing just to shut me up.
She probably wasn't happy about that.
I was 2 blocks away from the recruiter's office and passing the daily newspaper, and my mother, God rest her, said, "Joe, what about your journalism?" And I said, "Call Mom, stop the car." And I walked in and managed to get hired on the spot as a reporter for $35 a week and a free subscription to the daily paper. And that was where I started. But I can't think of a single other thing I would rather have done. I had a career that stretched for 55 years, and for 43 of those years, I went to war to cover Americans at war.
That's a remarkable career in and of itself. 40-some years covering wars. That's a commentary that I don't know how to handle, Judith Kay. That's a remarkable career, and obviously the things that you have experienced and seen have had profound effects upon you. Now, the publication of the book, We Were Soldiers Once, and by the way, you owe me some sleep from 25 years ago or so when I first read that book. I couldn't put the doggone thing down, and I dug it out the other day. I went to my library and dug it out and brought it over to show Judy. That brought you some unexpected attention because the story was so gripping and so well documented that it became an instant hit, and that had to bring you some unexpected exposure. How did that work with you, sir?
Well, I'm a modest man, and I've always tried to be. And all I can tell you is that General Moore and I spent 10 years researching and writing that book. We interviewed over 250 individuals, and this was back in the day when the worldwide phone book wasn't on 2 CDs. We had to find each of those 250 people we interviewed. We went to Vietnam to interview the commanding officers who fought against us. We wanted this story to be complete. And, most military, we all read military history, the general and I particularly. But, excuse me, previously military history usually was written by some general trying to get even with some other general, and or some academic who is writing from the papers and the archives, the after-action reports and things like that. And it was always said before that, there's no real need to interview the common soldier because all he knows is what he sees right in front of his foxhole. And we decided, well, that's true, but if you can find enough of them so that you complete the circle and you have one for every 20 yards, you end up with a greater truth of what really happened there. And one of my old general friends read the manuscript, and his remark was, Joe, you guys have just moved the goalposts 20 more yards out in military history. And I'm quite proud that a couple of years ago, Military History magazine polled 50 noted American military historians to choose the 10 best books ever written on war, and we made the cut. I think we were number 8.
You're to be congratulated for that.
Well, look at the work that went into that before.
We tried to tell the story thoroughly and honestly as we could. And that story is, it lives on.
That's the point. Even though it was 1965, think of that, November 1965, and here we are, 2015, November. The details of that experience are just as vivid with you as and all of the gentlemen who were there. As it was at that time. At the time of the interruption here, I started to ask you, sir, about General Moore. Is he in good health, sir?
Not so good. He's 93, going on 94 years of age, and pretty much confined to his home in Alabama. Sad to say.
Yes, well, I kind of understand that.
A vigorous, thoughtful man, and my best friend for half a century. So we hope he's with us for a while longer, but that's in God's hands.
Exactly. I look at Jim Ash here, who's behind the console, and think I want to look at him a couple more years because I'm 92 going on 93. Sir, covering major events today as opposed to 50 years ago, what would you say would be if there is a marked difference, what would it be, sir?
Well, first of all, the world is not covered today as it was 50 years ago. And what's happened and what's disappeared are the budgets of daily newspapers. Their business model is broken. Over the last 5 years, probably 60% of everyone employed as journalists by newspapers have been laid off, and they won't be rehired. They've all closed their foreign bureaus. They closed their national bureaus. They're now starting to close their state house bureaus. And I look at this and my blood runs cold, because I look at this and I think, who is going to keep the politicians' feet in the fire and keep them honest? If we don't have reporters, looking at them through a microscope.
Yes, a lot of them hide pretty easily through that microscope.
They do, and I worry about, we're in a world that grows steadily smaller and more interconnected, and we're not getting the news that we need in a timely fashion and in a thoughtful fashion. It worries me, because we're dumbing ourselves down at a time when we cannot afford that.
Couple that with the almost slavish obedience to political correctness, and we're in a hell of a shape.
I would say so.
This bent, hell bent to be politically correct, is just, in my judgment, and I recognize I'm just one little old fella, but I think I talked to a fellow from the National Defense University some years ago. I have a good friend who was on that foundation, and they used to come to Central Illinois for a break in the summer, and they would go to the Archer Daniel Midlands and the Caterpillars and so forth, and my good friend always had a cookout for them at his very nice place out in west of town. And I was visiting with an African general one time, and I said something about political correctness to him, and I said, this is a long time ago now, and I said, I think it's going to be it's a terrible thing for us. Oh, he says, I don't think that's going to help you or hurt you at all. Well, it is hurting us badly. That's a difference of opinion, of course. The fact that you were working in the field as a civilian, how much governmental control was exerted on you as you performed your repertorial duties, sir?
None at all. It's very interesting. Vietnam was the most openly, freely covered war in our history. World War I, World War II, there was official censorship. If you were a reporter covering the Army, you wore the uniform and you were subject to the Code of Military Justice. Mm-hmm. Your copy and your photos were passed through a censor, usually a colonel, mm-hmm. who had the authority to send it on or cut it in half or throw it in the trash can. Korea was not quite that stringent, but it was censorship by control of communication. Korea is a very rugged country, and you had to depend on the military for your communications to get your stories out. Mm-hmm. Vietnam, all you had to have was a letter from an editor, even of a weekly newspaper somewhere, and you were good to go. You went and got your press cards, and with that, you were free to travel on military transport, free to go to any unit in the country and spend 3 hours or 3 days or 3 weeks if you had the time. And nobody read your copy. To get that press card, you signed a single page of paper with about 5 very basic operational security rules. I will not report on troop movements while they're still underway. I will not report the actual number of friendly casualties in a battle while the battle is still being fought. Just, very simple 5 rules. By contrast, for the invasion of Iraq, to be embedded with the military, an American journalist had to sign a 36-page set of rules, double-sided, single-spaced, small type, that was clearly written by a committee of lawyers. And
bureaucracy at its best.
I think that I may be the only person, either in the press or in the military, who actually read the damn thing. and basically, if you followed these rules, you couldn't cover anything.
Might just well stay home.
It was all forbidden.
Oh dear.
But you got sent to a battalion. The guy who was really in control was the battalion commander, and he would be given his 5 correspondents, and he would sit them down and say, here are my rules. I don't care about the 36 pages. You can file when I tell you you can file. We're not going to stop the charge so that you can put out your satellite dish and send your story. You get to file when we stop. And, you can't say where we are, and you can't say who we are. Basic rules once again. And, something like 550, 600 correspondents went along on the invasion of Iraq. And the coverage was incredible. Now, what happened is 30 days after Baghdad fell, the number of correspondents embedded began dwindling rapidly. They had been out there for 3 months in the desert, and they were all exhausted, and they went home, and the number of people covering that war just slowly drifted down.
Well, it was a winnowing out process. Some are dedicated, some are not. Your entrepreneurial spirit kept you going, because that apparently, from a young fellow, that was a drive that you had.
Well, you had to have that to be there. Now, the other thing about the invasion of Iraq is I was working then for Knight Ridder newspapers, their Washington, D.C. bureau, and we controlled all of that. We figured out that it was costing Knight Ridder $32,000 a month to keep one reporter in Baghdad. That's a fierce amount of money out of a budget at a time when newspapers were beginning their downward spiral. So if you were to invade Iraq again, I don't know how many correspondents you would have, but I would suggest that it would be far, far less than in 2003. There's just not the money for it.
And perhaps without the dedication, the newsprint is facing that, as we all know, that great battle, and that's why they're having economic problems. We come on with the television, and that seems to satisfy most of the people. Whether the news is accurate or not, and there's some degree about that, certainly. I noticed, sir, that you had worked with, reading a little bit about you, had been working with General Colin Powell, and I would just pass a judgment that, not a judgment, but a statement that I note that he's been scrupulous about staying out of the public media, I think to his everlasting credit. I was always a great fan of General Powell's, and I thought he was a wonderful man in our country.
Absolutely. I worked for him for a year, and I was sworn into government service on September 10th, 2001. I raised my hand and took the oath, and I was standing in line the next day at the badge office at the State Department when they flew the planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And the world turned upside down, and I was very, very happy to be working for General Powell, one of the best bosses I ever had. What a remarkable man.
Yes, he was a man that you could count on. If he said yes or no, you knew it was a direct statement. You know, I was just sitting here thinking, you talk about raising your hand. When I enlisted in the Air Corps, I remember the captain who swore me in said, "Well, you're ours now, son," and I didn't know what the hell he meant, but I sure found out soon.
You found out.
I also noted that General Norman Schwarzkopf, by the way, Judith Kay, I used to listen to a radio program in the 30s about his father. It had to do with crime and so forth. I can't remember now, but anyway, General Schwarzkopf's father appeared on the radio. Anyway, he was one of our great generals, and he commented about our guest this morning, Mr. Galloway, one of the finest combat reporters of our generation. And this what says it best: a soldier's reporter and a soldier's friend. I thought that was high approbation, sir.
As high as it gets. I'm very proud of that. I have always, from the Battle of the Ia Drang, I left that battlefield knowing that 80 young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live, and another 130 were terribly wounded and would bear the scars of that all their lives. I left there with two things: an obligation on my shoulders to tell the truth about soldiers and a love for those soldiers. You know, Ronald Reagan said that Vietnam was a noble war. Well, he never fought a war, and he don't know. There are no noble wars. Wars are a confession of man's failure at its ultimate.
There you are.
But there are noble human beings in a war, and they are the common soldier who, you know, there was not a single politician in Washington, D.C. who could stand up and explain why we were sending 500,000 American boys to fight in the middle of a civil war 10,000 miles from our shores. You can't tell me that Vietnam posed a threat to the United States of America. It did not.
No.
But never mind that. The common soldier who was drafted and sent there to fight was willing to fight and die for the man on his right and the man on his left, his brothers. If that ain't noble, I don't know what is.
Absolutely right about that. I think of when President Reagan made that statement about some particular episode, and I remember his comment is, "Where do we get such men?" And I thought that was real. That speaks to what you just said, sir. I also noted that Judith Kay, you're awfully silent here this morning.
But I'm enjoying listening. You know, you talk about these soldiers, and they were kids. They were kids, and they didn't go to Canada. They went where they were told to go. They did what they were told to do, and the news ran both ways. It ran from Vietnam to the U.S. just as well as it ran from the U.S. to Vietnam. And they would hear and read about all this unrest and demonstrating going on in this country while they were over there being injured and killed, and seeing the same happen to their friends. Now, what in the world did they say about that?
Well, you know, they were really occupied with what was in front of them. They were occupied with trying to stay alive and keep their friends alive. And I won't say that the anti-war stuff back home didn't have any impact, but it had a lot less impact than you might think on the soldier in the field. First of all, he didn't get a lot of news up to date. He read the Stars and Stripes when one of them made its way out to the field, or his mama might cut a piece out of the local paper and put it in her next letter. But that's not the kind of communication we have today. It was very sporadic. And, you know, I just think that what impact those people had, the anti-war people, it was more back here than it was over there. And, you know, these young men were draftees. They were pulled out of their civilian life, and like you say, they didn't run away to Canada, and they didn't go down for their physical wearing pantyhose or something. they went, like their dad went to World War II and their older brother went to Korea. They felt they had a duty to serve, and the real bitterness comes in how they were received when they came home from a year's tour in hell. And somehow, miraculously, they survived, and they, on the plane coming into the West Coast, They were told to take their uniforms off and put on civilian clothes because they couldn't wear that uniform safely in the San Francisco airport.
What a disgrace.
A disgrace, absolutely. These boys didn't ask to go, they were sent. They were told, you go and serve under our flag at the orders of our commanders, and they did that. And they came home to a country that was split down the middle. Half of them hated them, and the other half didn't really care one way or the other. And they went home, and they couldn't even talk about what they had seen and done and suffered at their own dinner table. They just had to shut up. And that's so wrong. It's so wrong.
Mr.
You know, I work now. I work now for the Vietnam War 50th Anniversary Commemoration Project, which is chartered by Congress and paid for by the taxpayers.
Fair enough.
And it's run out of the office of the Secretary of Defense. And I travel this country doing film interviews with Vietnam veterans and capturing their stories before it's too late. The days and the numbers dwindle down to a precious few. And there's nothing I would rather be doing right now than that.
Sir, I noted that you are working with Ken Burns, who does a remarkable job in putting out these public broadcasting specials. He just covers a gamut in several subjects. And that should be a very interesting and a rewarding experience for you.
Absolutely. I've seen the roughs. And Mr. Burns is doing a 10-part, 2 hours each, documentary history of the Vietnam War. And, you know, what I've seen of it is magnificent. Mr. Burns is probably the greatest documentarian operating today. His pieces on the Civil War and World War II are just magnificent, and I can tell you that, in my opinion, the one on Vietnam, which should broadcast on PBS in 2017, I think.
Hope I'm here.
Yeah, I hope I'm here too. I told him, why not put it out now? It looks good enough to me, but good enough for me ain't good enough for Ken Burns.
I've talked too much here. My co-host, who's a wonderful lady, she sat here very quietly, and I'm going to have to go here buy her lunch or something. Before time's about to expire, but I want to mention one thing, sir, which is very significant to me. You received the Doughboy Award. Tell us what the Doughboy Award was.
The Doughboy Award, they give out 2 or 3 of them each year. It's the highest honor the U.S. Army Infantry gives to anyone. Usually to military people, very few civilians get it. I was quite surprised and honored to be chosen to receive that. It is, in fact, a wooden plaque with a World War I pipe pan helmet.
Think of it.
Chrome plated. And it's the Doughboy's helmet, and it's the Doughboy Award. I'm proud of that. I'm even more proud of the little pin I wear on my lapel, which is in token of the only Medal of Valor the U.S. Army awarded to a civilian during the entire Vietnam War.
Remarkable.
And that is the Bronze Star with V for Valor. Mm-hmm. For rescuing wounded soldiers under enemy fire in the Ia Drang.
Oh, there's so much.
I'm more proud of that than anything I can tell you about.
There's just so much that we could go on, and unfortunately, Mr. Ash runs a commercial operation here. He has sponsors we have to acknowledge periodically. Judy, do you have anything, a question before we close up with the comments?
I have no question. I just want to thank you so very much for being with us, Mr. Galloway. This has been most enlightening. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure entirely, and I enjoyed the interview, and I hope we managed to talk about some things that interest your audience.
We did very much, and we really sincerely appreciate the courtesy of your time. You're a busy guy. We should always try to close the Viewpoint with a program or the comment that tries to be appertaining to the subject matter of the day, and this is what I found. But in the end, they fought not for their country or their flag. They fought for each other. We who see in war will never stop seeing it. Thank you, Joseph Galloway, one of America's premier correspondents. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.